Imagine a world where the most powerful empire on Earth, the Roman Empire, seemed invincible. Its legions marched across continents, its emperors ruled with iron fists, and its gods were worshipped in grand temples from Britannia to Egypt. Yet in the shadows of this colossal civilization, a small, persecuted group of believers was about to ignite a revolution that would shake the very foundations of Rome. This is the story of the Christian Revolt, a movement that began with a handful of followers and ultimately transformed not just the empire, but the entire course of human history. To understand the magnitude of this transformation, we need to step back into the 1st century, a time when Rome was at the height of its power. The empire was a patchwork of cultures, languages, and religions, all held together by the might of Roman law and the promise of peace, Pax Romana. But beneath the surface, tensions simmered. The Roman world was a place of stark contrasts: opulent wealth and crushing poverty, freedom for the few and slavery for the many, tolerance for some beliefs and brutal suppression for others. It was in this world that Christianity was born, not in the palaces of emperors, but in the humble villages of Judea, a remote province on the empire's eastern edge. The story begins with Jesus of Nazareth, a charismatic preacher whose message of love, forgiveness, and the coming kingdom of God resonated with the poor and marginalized. His teachings challenged the established order, not just of Jewish religious authorities, but of Roman power itself. When Jesus was crucified, a punishment reserved for the lowest criminals, it seemed his movement would die with him. But something extraordinary happened. His followers claimed that Jesus had risen from the dead, and this belief became the cornerstone of a new faith. At first, Christianity was just one of many sects within Judaism, but it quickly began to attract converts from all walks of life: Jews and Gentiles, slaves and free, men and women. The message was radical. In Christ, there was neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female. All were equal in the eyes of God. Contrast this with the rigid hierarchies of Roman society, where status and power were everything. The Christian promise of spiritual equality was not just appealing, it was revolutionary. It offered hope to the hopeless, dignity to the despised, and a sense of belonging to the outcast. No wonder the movement spread like wildfire, even in the face of fierce opposition. The Roman authorities, for their part, saw Christianity as a threat, not because Christians were violent, they weren't, but because they refused to worship the emperor or the traditional gods. In a society where religion and politics were inseparable, this was seen as an act of rebellion. Christians were accused of atheism, treason, and even cannibalism thanks to misunderstandings about the Eucharist. Persecution followed, sometimes sporadic, sometimes intense. Christians were arrested, tortured, and executed in gruesome spectacles meant to deter others. Yet the more the empire tried to stamp out the movement, the more it grew. The blood of the martyrs, as one early Christian writer put it, became the seed of the church. Stories of courage and faith in the face of death inspired others to join. Underground networks of believers formed, meeting in secret, sharing meals, and caring for the sick and the poor. In a world where life was often brutal and short, the Christian community offered something rare: compassion, solidarity, and hope. What made this revolt so different from others in Roman history was its nature. It wasn't a violent uprising, like the slave revolts led by Spartacus or the Jewish revolts in Judea. Instead, it was a revolution of the heart and mind, a quiet, persistent challenge to the values of the empire. Christians refused to conform, even when it cost them everything. They rejected the cult of the emperor, the brutality of the gladiatorial games, and the casual cruelty of Roman society. They cared for abandoned infants, tended to the sick during plagues, and welcomed strangers as family. This contrast between the Christian ethic and the Roman way of life became increasingly stark as the movement grew. By the 2nd and 3rd centuries, Christianity had spread throughout the empire, from the bustling streets of Rome to the distant frontiers. It attracted intellectuals and laborers, aristocrats and slaves. Its leaders wrote letters and treatises, debated philosophy, and organized communities. Despite waves of persecution, the church endured and even thrived. The turning point came in the early 4th century with the rise of Emperor Constantine. In a dramatic reversal, Constantine embraced Christianity, ending centuries of persecution and granting the faith legal status. The reasons for his conversion are still debated. Was it a genuine spiritual awakening, a political calculation, or both? Whatever the motive, the impact was profound. Christianity went from being an outlawed sect to the favored religion of the empire. But this was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a new chapter. The Christian revolt had succeeded in changing the Roman Empire, but it also faced new challenges. As the church gained power and influence, it had to navigate the temptations of wealth, politics, and compromise. The very movement that had once stood against the empire now found itself at its center. So, what can we learn from this extraordinary story? The Christian revolt was not just a religious movement. It was a social, cultural, and political revolution. It challenged the values of the most powerful empire in history and offered a new vision of what it meant to be human. It showed that even the smallest voices, when united by faith and conviction, can change the world. As we continue this journey, we'll explore how the Christian movement spread, how it survived persecution, and how it ultimately transformed the Roman Empire from within. We'll meet the heroes and villains, the martyrs and the emperors, and discover how their choices shaped the world we live in today. To truly grasp the scale of the Christian revolt, we need to look at how this movement, born in obscurity, managed to spread across the vast and diverse territories of the Roman Empire. The story of this expansion is not just about faith, it's about strategy, resilience, and the power of ideas to transcend borders and barriers. In the decades after Jesus' death, his followers began to travel far beyond Judea. The Roman world, for all its brutality, offered something unique: roads, cities, and a common language. The famous Roman roads built for the swift movement of armies became the highways of the Christian message. Greek, spoken widely across the Eastern Mediterranean, allowed ideas to flow from one community to another. The apostles, most famously Paul, used these networks to carry the gospel to new lands. Paul's journeys are legendary. He traveled from city to city, preaching in synagogues and marketplaces, debating with philosophers, and writing letters to fledgling Christian communities. These letters, or epistles, would become the backbone of Christian teaching, offering guidance, encouragement, and sometimes stern rebuke. Paul's message was clear: the good news of Jesus was for everyone, not just a chosen few. This universal appeal set Christianity apart from many other religions of the time, which were often tied to specific places or peoples. Contrast this with the traditional Roman religions, which were deeply local and ritualistic. Each city had its own gods, its own festivals, its own sacred spaces. Religion was less about personal belief and more about public duty, making the right sacrifices, honoring the right deities, keeping the peace with the divine. Christianity, by contrast, was intensely personal. It called for a change of heart, a new way of living, and a commitment that went beyond mere ritual. This difference was both a strength and a source of conflict. As Christianity spread, it attracted people from all walks of life: merchants, soldiers, slaves, women, and even some members of the elite. The Christian communities were known for their inclusivity and their care for the vulnerable. In a world where social safety nets were almost non-existent, the church provided food for the hungry, care for widows and orphans, and support for the sick. This practical compassion was a powerful draw, especially during times of crisis.
One of the most striking examples came during the Great Plagues that swept through the empire in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. While many fled the cities to escape disease, Christians stayed behind to care for the sick and dying, often at personal great risk. Their willingness to sacrifice for others did not go unnoticed. Even pagan observers remarked on the courage and charity of the Christians. In a society where life could be cheap and suffering was everywhere, the Christian ethic of love and service stood out as something radically different. But this difference also made Christians targets. Their refusal to participate in traditional religious rituals was seen as subversive, even dangerous. The Roman authorities valued order above all else, and religion was a key part of that order. To refuse to honor the gods was to risk the wrath of the divine, and by extension, the stability of the state. Christians were accused of undermining the social fabric, of bringing disaster upon the community. Persecution was the result. The nature of this persecution varied from place to place and from one emperor to another. Sometimes it was local and sporadic, driven by mob violence or the whims of a provincial governor. At other times, it was systematic and empire-wide, as under emperors like Decius and Diocletian. Christians were arrested, tortured, and executed in public spectacles designed to terrify others into conformity. The stories of the martyrs, men, women, and even children who chose death over denial became central to Christian identity. Yet paradoxically, persecution often strengthened the movement. The courage of the martyrs inspired others to join. Their stories were told and retold, written down in letters and chronicles, celebrated in song and art. The catacombs of Rome, where Christians buried their dead and sometimes worshipped in secret, became symbols of both suffering and hope. The more the empire tried to crush the movement, the more it seemed to grow. This resilience was rooted in the Christian vision of history. Unlike the cyclical view of time common in the ancient world, Christians believed in a story with a beginning, a middle, and an end. A story in which God was at work even in the darkest moments. Suffering was not meaningless. It was part of a larger plan. The hope of resurrection, the promise of a new creation, gave believers the strength to endure. As the movement grew, it also became more organized. Local communities were led by bishops, elders, and deacons who provided spiritual guidance and practical leadership. Councils were held to resolve disputes and clarify doctrine. The church developed rituals, baptism, communion, confession, that bound believers together across time and space. Despite differences in language, culture, and custom, Christians saw themselves as part of one body, united by faith. This sense of unity was both a strength and a challenge. As the church expanded, it faced questions about identity and authority. Who could speak for the community? What beliefs were essential and which were optional? How should Christians relate to the wider world? These debates sometimes led to conflict, even schism, but they also produced a rich tradition of theology, philosophy, and art, a legacy that would shape Western civilization for centuries to come. By the early 4th century, Christianity was no longer a fringe movement. It had become a significant force within the empire, with communities in every major city and a growing influence among the elite. The stage was set for a dramatic confrontation between the old order and the new faith, a confrontation that would change the Roman Empire forever.
The early 4th century was a time of crisis for the Roman Empire. Decades of civil war, economic turmoil, and external threats had weakened the once mighty state. Emperors rose and fell with dizzying speed, and the unity that had held the empire together for centuries seemed to be unraveling. It was in this atmosphere of uncertainty and change that the Christian movement reached a critical turning point, a moment that would not only secure its survival, but also propel it to the very heart of imperial power. The man at the center of this transformation was Constantine, a shrewd and ambitious general who would become one of the most consequential figures in world history. Constantine's rise to power was nothing but straightforward. After the death of his father, Constantius, in 306 CE, Constantine was proclaimed emperor by his troops in the far western province of Britannia. But the empire was divided, and several rivals also claimed the throne. Years of bloody conflict followed as Constantine fought to establish his supremacy. The pivotal moment came in 312 CE, on the eve of the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, just outside Rome. According to later Christian sources, Constantine experienced a vision, a cross of light in the sky, accompanied by the words, "In this sign, conquer." Taking this as a divine message, Constantine ordered his soldiers to paint the Christian symbol, the Chi Rho, on their shields. Against the odds, he won a decisive victory, securing his position as ruler of the Western Empire. Constantine's conversion to Christianity has been the subject of endless debate. Was it a genuine spiritual awakening, a calculated political move, or some combination of both? The truth may never be fully known. What is clear is that Constantine's embrace of Christianity marked a dramatic shift in the fortunes of the faith. For the first time, a Roman emperor openly supported the Christian cause, ending centuries of official persecution. The Edict of Milan, issued in 313 CE by Constantine and his co-emperor Licinius, granted religious tolerance to Christians and restored confiscated property to the church. This was a watershed moment. No longer outlaws, Christians could now worship openly, build churches, and participate in public life. The church, once a persecuted minority, began to emerge as a powerful institution within the empire. But Constantine's support went far beyond mere tolerance. He lavished the church with gifts, land, money, and privileges. He commissioned the construction of grand basilicas, including the original St. Peter's in Rome and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. He involved himself in church affairs, calling councils to resolve theological disputes and promoting unity among believers. Under Constantine's patronage, Christianity became increasingly intertwined with the machinery of state. This new relationship brought both opportunities and challenges. On the one hand, the church gained unprecedented influence. Christian leaders were consulted on matters of policy, and the moral teachings of the faith began to shape imperial law. The values of compassion, charity, and justice, so central to the Christian message, found new expression in the public sphere. Hospitals, orphanages, and charitable institutions flourished, supported by imperial funds. On the other hand, the church now faced the temptations of power. The very movement that had once stood in opposition to the empire was now at risk of becoming part of the establishment. Bishops gained wealth and status, sometimes rivaling the local aristocracy. Theological disputes, once matters of internal debate, now had political consequences. Emperors intervened in church affairs, sometimes with heavy hands, seeking to impose unity and suppress dissent. The most famous of these interventions came at the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE. Called by Constantine himself, the council brought together bishops from across the empire to resolve a bitter dispute over the nature of Christ. The result was the Nicene Creed, a statement of faith that remains central to Christian belief to this day. But the council also set a precedent for imperial involvement in religious matters, a legacy that would shape the church for centuries. The transformation of Christianity from a persecuted sect to an imperial religion was not without its critics. Some believers worried that the church was losing its soul, trading the radical message of Jesus for the comforts of power. Monastic movements arose in response, as men and women retreated to the desert to seek a purer, more authentic faith. These monks and nuns became the conscience of the church, reminding it of its roots in humility, sacrifice, and service. Yet for all its challenges, the Christianization of the Roman Empire was a revolution unlike any other. It was not achieved by force of arms, but by the power of conviction. It did not seek to overthrow the state, but to transform it from within. The values that had once set Christians apart, love for enemies, care for the poor, the dignity of every person, began to reshape the very fabric of Roman society. The contrast with the old order could not have been more stark. The traditional Roman virtues, strength, honor, loyalty to the state, were now joined by new ideals of mercy, forgiveness, and humility. The gladiatorial games, once a symbol of Roman power and cruelty, began to decline as Christian emperors condemned them. The practice of exposing unwanted infants, common in the ancient world, was outlawed. Slavery, while not abolished, was increasingly challenged by the Christian teaching that all were equal before God. The Christian revolt had succeeded in changing the empire, but it had also changed itself. The church was no longer a community of outcasts and rebels. It was now a central institution of Roman life. This new reality brought both promise and peril. The challenge was to remain true to the radical vision of Jesus, even as the church wielded unprecedented influence. As we look back on this extraordinary transformation, it is clear that the Christian revolt was not just a moment in history, it was a turning point for civilization. It redefined what it meant to be Roman, what it meant to be human, and what it meant to hope for a better world. The legacy of this revolution can be felt today in the values, institutions, and ideals that shape our lives.
The Christianization of the Roman Empire was not a simple or uncontested process. Even as Christianity gained imperial favor, the old pagan traditions did not simply vanish overnight. For centuries, temples to Jupiter, Mars, and Venus had dominated the skylines of Roman cities. Festivals, sacrifices, and rituals were woven into the fabric of daily life. The transition from a pagan to a Christian empire was gradual, complex, and at times deeply contentious. In the decades following Constantine, the empire saw a series of Christian emperors, each with their own approach to the new faith. Some, like Constantine's son, Constantius II, were zealous in their efforts to suppress paganism, closing temples and banning sacrifices. Others, like Julian, known to history as Julian the Apostate, tried to revive the old gods and restore the ancient cults. Julian's brief reign was a dramatic attempt to turn back the tide, but it ultimately failed. The momentum was with the Christians. By the end of the 4th century, under the rule of Theodosius I, Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire. Theodosius issued edicts banning pagan worship, closing temples, and making Christianity the only legal faith. The old gods, once the guardians of Rome, were now relegated to the shadows. Statues were toppled, altars destroyed, and sacred groves cut down. The transformation was not always peaceful. There were riots, protests, and acts of violence on both sides, but the direction was clear. The empire was now Christian. This dramatic shift was not just about religion. It was about identity, power, and the meaning of Rome itself. For centuries, Roman identity had been tied to the worship of the gods and the rituals of the state. To be Roman was to honor Jupiter, to sacrifice at the altar, to participate in the festivals that marked the turning of the year. Now, a new identity was emerging, one rooted in the teachings of Christ, the authority of the church, and the promise of salvation. The contrast between the old and new orders was visible everywhere. Pagan temples were converted into churches. Christian symbols replaced images of the gods on coins, monuments, and official documents. The calendar itself was transformed, as Christian holidays replaced pagan festivals. The rhythms of life, birth, marriage, death, were now marked by Christian rites. But this transformation was not just imposed from above, it was also driven by the choices and convictions of ordinary people. Across the empire, men and women wrestled with questions of faith, tradition, and loyalty. Some clung to the old ways, practicing pagan rituals in secret or blending them with Christian beliefs. Others embraced the new faith with zeal, becoming missionaries, martyrs, or monks. The process of conversion was messy, uneven, and deeply personal. One of the most remarkable aspects of this period was the rise of Christian intellectual life. As the church gained power, it attracted some of the brightest minds of the age. Thinkers like Augustine of Hippo, Ambrose of Milan, and Jerome helped to shape the theology, philosophy, and culture of the new Christian empire. They debated questions of faith and reason, the nature of God, and the meaning of history. Their writings became the foundation of Western thought, influencing not just religion, but law, politics, and education. Augustine, in particular, stands out as a towering figure. Born in North Africa, he lived through the tumultuous years of the late empire, witnessing both its glories and its decline. In his famous work, The City of God, Augustine offered a new vision of history. He argued that the true destiny of humanity was not tied to the rise and fall of empires, but to the eternal city of God, a community of believers united by faith and love. This idea would shape the Christian imagination for centuries, offering hope in times of crisis and a sense of purpose beyond the struggles of the present. The Christianization of the empire also brought profound changes to social life. The church became a center of community, education, and charity. Bishops and priests played key roles in local government, mediating disputes, caring for the poor, and organizing relief during times of famine or disaster. Monasteries became centers of learning, preserving ancient texts and cultivating the arts of reading, writing, and music. The values of compassion, humility, and service, so central to the Christian message, began to reshape the norms of society. Yet the process was not without its contradictions. The church, now allied with imperial power, sometimes found itself complicit in the very injustices it had once opposed. Wealth and privilege crept in, and the line between spiritual authority and political ambition grew blurry. Debates over doctrine could turn violent as rival factions vied for control. Heresies were condemned, sometimes with the force of law. The unity that Constantine had sought to impose was always fragile, threatened by internal divisions and external pressures. Despite these challenges, the Christian revolt had achieved something extraordinary. It had transformed the Roman Empire from within, replacing the old gods with a new vision of humanity and destiny. The empire that had once crucified Jesus and persecuted his followers was now the champion of his message. The cross, once a symbol of shame and defeat, had become the emblem of victory and hope. This transformation was not just a matter of politics or power. It was a revolution of the heart and mind, a reimagining of what it meant to live, to love, and to hope. The Christian message of forgiveness, redemption, and eternal life offered a new way of seeing the world, a way that would outlast the empire itself. As the Roman Empire entered its final centuries, battered by invasions, economic decline, and internal strife, the legacy of the Christian revolt endured. The church, now firmly established, would become the guardian of knowledge, culture, and faith through the dark and turbulent times ahead. The seeds planted by the early Christians, seeds of compassion, justice, and hope, would continue to grow, shaping the future of Europe and the world.
As the Roman Empire moved into its twilight, the Christian revolt that had once seemed so improbable was now the defining force of a new era. The empire's borders were under constant threat from Germanic tribes, Persians, and other peoples who pressed against its weakening frontiers. Internally, the old systems of administration and economy were crumbling. Yet amid this decline, the Christian church stood as a beacon of stability, continuity, and hope. The fall of Rome in the West, traditionally dated to 476 CE, did not mean the end of the Christian story. Far from it. In fact, the collapse of imperial authority only highlighted the church's growing importance. As Roman officials fled or were replaced by barbarian kings, bishops and priests often stepped in to fill the void.
In cities like Rome, Milan, and Ravenna, the church became the primary institution of governance, education, and social welfare. The Bishop of Rome, later known as the Pope, emerged as a figure of immense spiritual and political influence. This was a remarkable reversal of fortune. The movement that had begun with a crucified criminal in a remote province was now the custodian of civilization itself. The church preserved the wisdom of the ancient world, copying manuscripts, teaching the young, and maintaining the arts of architecture, music, and philosophy. Monasteries dotted the landscape, serving as centers of learning, agriculture, and hospitality. The Christian ideal of service to others, so radical in the days of the early church, became the foundation of a new social order. But the legacy of the Christian revolt was not confined to Europe. As the Western Empire fell, the Eastern Roman Empire, known to us as Byzantium, endured for another 1,000 years. Centered in the magnificent city of Constantinople, the Byzantine Empire became a bastion of Christian faith, culture, and power. Emperors like Justinian saw themselves as defenders of orthodoxy, building great churches like Hagia Sophia and codifying laws that reflected Christian values. The Byzantine Church developed its own rich traditions of theology, art, and worship, influencing the Slavic world and beyond. Meanwhile, Christian missionaries carried the faith far beyond the old boundaries of Rome. From Ireland to Ethiopia, from Armenia to India, the message of Jesus spread along trade routes through the work of monks, merchants, and travelers. The Christian revolt, once a local uprising, had become a global movement. Its vision of a universal community, transcending race, class, and nation, continued to inspire new generations. Yet, the story of the Christian revolt is not just one of triumph. It is also a story of struggle, contradiction, and ongoing transformation. The alliance between church and state, forged in the days of Constantine, brought both blessings and dangers. The church gained power and influence, but it also faced the temptations of wealth, corruption, and violence. Crusades, inquisitions, and schisms would mar its history, reminding us that the ideals of the Christian message were not always realized in practice. Still, the core of the Christian revolt, the radical vision of love, equality, and hope, remained a powerful force for change. Throughout the Middle Ages and into the modern world, reformers and prophets would return to the teachings of Jesus, calling the church and society back to its roots. Movements for justice, peace, and human dignity have often drawn inspiration from the same message that once challenged the might of Rome. The contrast between the world before and after the Christian revolt could hardly be more striking. In the ancient world, power was everything. The strong ruled the weak, and the gods were seen as distant, capricious, and often cruel. Human life was cheap, and suffering was accepted as the natural order of things. The Christian message turned this worldview upside down. It proclaimed that every person, no matter how poor or powerless, was loved by God and worthy of respect. It called for mercy, forgiveness, and the transformation of society from the bottom up. This new vision did not erase all the evils of the world, but it planted seeds of change that would bear fruit over centuries. The abolition of slavery, the rise of hospitals and schools, the development of human rights, all can trace their roots, in part, to the Christian revolt that began in the Roman Empire. The language of equality, justice, and compassion that shapes our world today owes much to those early believers who dared to defy the empire in the name of a higher truth. As we reflect on this extraordinary story, it is easy to forget just how unlikely it all was. The Roman Empire was the superpower of its age, seemingly unassailable. The early Christians were a tiny, marginalized group without armies, wealth, or political influence. Yet through courage, conviction, and the power of their message, they changed the world. Their revolt was not of swords and spears, but of hearts and minds. It was a revolution that began in the shadows and ended at the very center of power. The legacy of the Christian revolt is still with us. In every act of kindness, every movement for justice, every hope for a better world, we can see echoes of that ancient uprising. The story of how a persecuted faith transformed the greatest empire on earth is a reminder that history is not just made by emperors and armies, but ordinary people who dared to believe in something greater than themselves.
So the next time you walk past a church, read a story of compassion, or hear a call for justice, remember the Christian revolt that changed the Roman Empire forever. It's a story of faith and courage, of struggle and hope, a story that continues to shape our world in ways both seen and unseen.